Hi, Kangs. My name is Reva.
And my name is Morgan, and we're juniors at LW this year.
Today, we're here with Senator Manka Dhingra to have a chat about her career as an Indian American attorney and politician, as well as her impact on the AAPI community. Senator Dhingra, would you mind giving a quick introduction about who you are, how you fit into the AAPI community, and your career?
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure for me to be here with both of you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I always enjoy coming and talking to Lake Washington students. So my name is Manka Dhingra. I'm the state senator representing the 45th Legislative District. I am also the deputy majority leader of the Washington State Senate. And we actually have two deputy majority leaders, me and Senator Saldana, both women of color. First time that's ever happened. I am also the first Sikh American legislator in the country. And I chair a behavioral health subcommittee. I'm vice chair of law and justice, and I sit on a ways and means committee. I'm someone who's new to politics. Well, I guess not new anymore. I attended my first Democratic Party meeting December 2016. And before that, I was a senior deputy prosecuting attorney with King County, where I created and chaired the Therapeutic Alternative Unit. And I was, again, the first South Asian prosecutor that we've had in King County and possibly even the state.
How has your identity as part of the AAPI community influenced your career and your perspectives?
You know, we wear our identities and a full persona everywhere we are. Being the first is always a challenge, but it's just so important because you have to make sure you're breaking those glass ceilings and opening the door and keeping it open behind you. So, starting as a career as a deputy prosecuting attorney, I started off with me being in a courthouse, in a courtroom, standing at counsel table, and I would have defense come up to me and say, "Hey, can you get the prosecutor for me?" And I'll be like, "I am the prosecutor," because in their image, it was not a woman who looked like me. Over the years, as I became a supervisor, I would, be in court, and someone's like, "Can you have the supervisor, prove that?" And I'll say, "I am the supervisor." So, it's there on a constant level. But a lot of me as a Sikh American came into my work dealing with hate crimes after 9/11. We had a Sikh cab driver in Seattle who got assaulted. And so I got involved in working on hate crimes in our county. And, that's really where providing that cultural competence to law enforcement, to our community on the perception of what it means to be Sikh American just became really a lot of the work that I did. And these days now, with the anti-Asian backlash and the hate crimes we're seeing, all of that work that I've been doing just kind of continues in that arena. And we have to always kind of show up and frankly educate a lot of people on their biases. So it's a daily thing.
This is just a quick question. Are you a first gen Indian American, Sikh American, or your
So
parents are from India?
yeah, so it's really interesting about my story. It's kind of unusual. My father came here in the late 60s for his master's. And so he went to USC. And at that time, most people kind of stayed on. But he and my mother had an arranged marriage, and she did not want to live in the US. So they moved. So he moved to India. So I was born in India. We ended up moving here when I was 13 because his side of the family was actually here. They'd moved here in the 60s and 70s. And so I feel like I straddle both worlds because while I was born in India, I was very influenced by the half of my family that was here. And then I grew up in California. So I always feel like I'm 1.5.
What are some challenges or adversities that you have overcome that sort of revolve around your race? You mentioned how people, I guess, wouldn't take you seriously because of your gender and then the color of your skin, unfortunately. But along with that, what other challenges have you faced?
So, one of the jobs that I did as chair of the Therapeutic Alternative Unit, I helped create and facilitate the 40-hour crisis intervention training for law enforcement. And so I wanted to share a story of my experience there to really explain to you how embedded this, race is in our culture. So I've been doing this training for a couple of years. I'm just one instructor in the whole week-long training. And, after you do it a few times, it's good to audit the whole class. So I decided I was going to audit the class this one week. So I walk in, and it just so happened that class was 100% male. And so I find a seat in the back of the classroom. Like I go sit down there. It's an auditorium style classroom, and the first speaker shows up, and the guy in front of me, this police officer, fairly young, turns around and says, "Hey, honey, can you get me a cup of coffee?" And I looked at him and I said, "No." And then he kind of turns around and he gets up to get himself coffee. And I say, "Hey, can you get me a cup of coffee?" And he does bring me a cup of coffee. And an hour later, it's my turn to present. So I stand up, go to the front of the class, and I do my presentation. And then he comes up to me. He goes, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I deeply apologize for my behavior." And the only reason he apologized to me is because I was a senior deputy prosecuting attorney. I chaired a unit, and in his mind, that was worthy of the apology. Not before, when he didn't know what my title was. And so, people treat you differently because of their perception of who you are and the way you show up. And, another story I have is, soon after my election, which got really national coverage because we flipped the Senate in the state of Washington. I was at the grocery store shopping, and this woman comes up to me and she goes, "You look so familiar. Where do I know you from?" And so I'm like, "Oh, I don't know. I've lived here for a very long time." And she goes, "Are you the lady that threads my eyebrows?" And I'm like, "No, I'm actually your state senator." And then she's like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." And it's the thing, she found me familiar. So she was trying to put in her mind, in her experience, where she may have come across a South Asian woman. And she thought of the woman who does her eyebrows.
So how do you believe the fight for AAPI equality fits in with the larger fight for racial equality?
This is actually a fascinating topic, one that we actually talked a lot about this session. It's really important for us, and us, I mean just the community in general, to really understand how we show up when we are talking about equity. Decades and decades ago, colonialism set up the divide and conquer concept, right? Pitting groups against each other in the hopes that you can keep control because the groups are fighting within themselves, and so you don't get them to rise. And so we have to really make sure we're taking that head on. That if you are elevating Black Americans does not mean we're putting down any other ethnic group. And we as Asians have to acknowledge the anti-Blackness that exists within our culture as well. And a lot of it, especially, and I'll say for the Indians, comes from colonialism. But really have an honest conversation about anti-Blackness that exists in the Asian communities and be in a position to address it. We as Asians have really benefited from the civil rights movement in America. And so I think it's important for us to understand that we have a lot of our privileges and our the manner in which we have accessed immigration because of the civil rights movement in the US. So I think anytime you talk about equity, anytime you talk about racial justice, it's not related to just one race or one ethnic group. When you're creating awareness, when you're creating the concept where people have to be more thoughtful about their approach, you're helping every single sector. You're helping every single ethnic minority. So to me, these are not mutually exclusive. I truly do believe that when you uphold one group, you are upholding everyone else. And so I think the more conversation we can see about us and we versus you and me, I think the better off we all are as a society.
Aloha kako, aloha everybody, and thank you for inviting me and welcoming me to be part of this virtual event, this interview here. Like Reva mentioned, my name is Blair-Stahn, and I'm a lecturer here at Leeward Community College, where I've been a teacher in Pacific Island Studies for the past couple years, and also I now teach a Hawaiian Studies class as well. And as a part-time job, I work at the Hawaii Nature Center. So I do environmental education with younger kids and get to share my passion for the culture and the environment with the next generation. My ancestry is from Central America, from the Caribbean, and from Europe. So for me, I don't identify directly in terms of my ethnicity. And then being in Hawaii as well, I wasn't born or raised here. But I can say that the experiences I've had over my time have shaped how I teach and how I live my life. Through my experiences as a hula dancer, through my experiences doing other cultural practices, certainly heavily shape the ways I teach, the ways I think, the ways I interact with my students. Coming at things from a more culturally sensitive perspective, and of course being aware of the fact that I'm not from this place.
How do your specific experiences, like you mentioned, hula dancing, and all your conservatism efforts impact how you teach Pacific Island Studies to your students? What exactly? How does it shape it?
Yeah, for me, having these firsthand experiences is very meaningful, because I can talk about things not just from a textbook perspective or just facts in a book, but it's lived experiences and practices that make sense for me. So for example, when I start my semester with the students, I begin with a chant to welcome them and acknowledge them and welcome them into that space. So it's being able to kind of navigate between, I think, more of a traditional Western academic classroom, and then bringing in indigenous forms of knowing and being into that space. And a big thing that we talk about is decolonization. And so we can look at decolonization in terms of actual, physical ways that we might be linked to foreign powers, like Hawaii being occupied by the United States, or other nations in Oceania that have political or economic links to, say, Australia or Aotearoa, New Zealand. But beyond that, a big part of it is, as one of the scholars, Apeli Hau'ofa, talks about these mental reservations, or this idea of colonization of the mind and the way that we see ourselves and we see our surroundings. And so the classroom can be a very colonial space, right, with its four walls and the kind of information that normally gets taught, the kinds of information that typically gets valued, which doesn't tend to be oral traditions, or it doesn't tend to be perspectives written by the native voice. So in my classroom, we try to bring those other alternative ways of knowing back into this academic context to really, in a sense, subvert the system, but provide different perspectives. And so even though I myself am not Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, I can still support and honor those knowledge systems by teaching about them and sharing them in my classroom.
So yeah, what sort of challenges are the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities facing right now?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of issues that we can look at. Broadly speaking, of course, there across the region and in Hawaii as well, there are issues dealing with sovereignty, so gaining political independence as one form of sovereignty, but we can also look at sovereignty in terms of, economic stability or instability, militarism, tourism that's influencing places, food sovereignty, and the fact that in Hawaii we import, they say, up to 90% or more of the food we eat on a daily basis. So those are all really important issues, kind of on the broad scale, that are being addressed.
What's been happening with, Asian hate in Hawaii, and has there been any, impact on Asian populations right now?
Issues of racism are different than on the continent. And in Hawaii, we have quite a diverse population. Caucasians, white people, are not the majority here. And we have people from all around the world who live in the islands. Obviously, Native Hawaiians, people with indigenous ancestry, people who have ancestry from China, Japan, Korea, Portugal, Puerto Rico. and all of these different cultures that have come along with it. And most people identifying and having multiple ethnicities, right? Not just one or the other, but a very blended personal life. And then it tends to be celebrated, all of the diversity. But there is, of course, a lot of solidarity, I think, behind Asian American rights and Black Lives Matter. Over the summer, with all of the Black Lives Matter stuff in the summer of 2020,
Right.
we had a big rally and a big march here in Hawaii, and people turned out for that. And a lot of discussion about where is the presence of Black lives in Hawaii, and even looking back in historical connections within the Hawaiian kingdom, and acknowledging that the Kingdom of Hawaii outlawed slavery. And so when you have legal slavery in the United States, any escaped slave or anybody who came to the Kingdom of Hawaii was granted freedom. And these kinds of topics, which again feed into the present day reality of what it's like to live in Hawaii and the mindset that most people have.
My name is Lori Matsukawa. I was born and raised in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. I'm what they call Sansei, third generation Japanese American. My grandparents came from Japan. My parents were both born in Hawaii, so they were citizens. And I'm the third generation. Most people know me because I worked for 36 years at King 5 Television in front of the news cameras. I was an anchor, reporter, and in my earlier years, when I wasn't at King, I worked at several other television stations as a producer and writer. So I had to do pretty much everything in my career, and it was a terrific career. I retired in 2019, but not until I had finished what I considered my opus. And it's appropriate that I bring it up here at this point, because my opus, my big work, was to do an overarching story about the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. Not just that it happened, but that it had consequences. What happened after people returned from the camps? What was their life like? The third segment was about the conflict that erupted between Japanese Americans in their own community. How did the Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight in the army during World War II feel about the Japanese Americans who protested and resisted the draft because they felt that their constitutional rights were violated, and they were, and they wanted to put up a constitutional court fight. So there was a big conflict within the community there. The fourth segment dealt with the movement to get redress for the Japanese American community. Let's get the government to acknowledge that a wrong was done and to compensate those who survived the camps with actual dollars, and to install a fund that would help educate the country as to what happened and why it shouldn't happen again. And this fund resulted in several movies, documentaries, books being published, plays, all sorts of terrific educational things that happen. The last segment was how the story is being retold today, usually in the arts community. So through spoken word, through opera, through painting, through movies, of course. People are telling the story. It's part educational, it's part artistic, but it's a way for our younger generation to hear the story and retell the story, because the worst thing would be to have this, happen again.
What are some challenges or adversities in your career as a journalist that you have overcome because of your race?
It's hard to believe how much the industry has changed. When I first came to Seattle, there was kind of an unspoken code that if every station had one Asian on the air, that was cool. They filled their Asian quota, person of color quota. So it was very difficult to have more than one Asian American hired in a newsroom in Seattle. Even in Seattle, which I consider a pretty progressive city, even back then. So I am very proud that I was the first Asian American or woman of color to anchor a weeknight news show. Back in the day, the 5, 6:30, and 11 newscasts were the main newscasts of a station. And so if you got the Monday through Friday weeknight anchor slot, that was a big deal. So I was the first to be selected. That was in 1998. So it wasn't all that long ago to become the first, woman of color. And then I got pulled off of that after a year and a half or so. They just kind of said, oh, you're not going to do that anymore. We're going to replace you with a Caucasian woman, and you're going to work on the cable newscast. And I was devastated personally, but it also angered the communities of color in Seattle. They started writing to the station. They started calling the station. They were upset that someone that they had looked to as a representative of their community had vanished all of a sudden from weeknight newscasts. And so this kind of became the status quo. And I had a choice, right? I could go and work someplace else, or I could stick around and see what happens and just be there. I mean, I was still anchoring on cable TV, and I was still filling in on King during weeknights when the other anchors weren't there. So I still had a platform. So I made the choice to stay, even though I wasn't the big cheese, right? And I'm so glad I did, because after a couple of years, the woman who they had picked went off to do some other job. And they said, Lori, can you fill in for her until we do our nationwide search and find her replacement? I said, sure, I'll fill in. And ever since then, I was in the anchor chair weeknights. So it was a good thing I stayed, because I think the most important thing was to be there, even though it can be controversial and you can, suffer from being a minority woman. I think, persevering and, staying, being there is very important. And through the years, I can't tell you how many times young people would say, because I saw you on TV, I thought I can do that job too. And I think it was very encouraging for the next generation.
Yeah, so my name is Kent Lee. I am based in San Diego. I professionally am the executive director of an organization called Pacific Arts Movement, which helps to present the San Diego Asian Film Festival. And I also chair what's called the San Diego Asian Pacific Islander Coalition, which is a platform of more than 30 organizations that came together primarily to combat anti-Asian racism and xenophobia during the pandemic.
What does it mean to be a part of the AAPI community?
Wow, that is a complex question to answer, because I have always been amazed at how even just the term Asian Pacific Islander represents more than a third of the population of the world, just in those 3 words. And when you think about the breadth of diversity that represents in terms of cultures, nationalities, languages, it's really, really broad. And so I think I'm always reminded that, if anything, it really represents a really broad and diverse element of our community that also, I think, over the years has not necessarily been as visible in terms of a voice and in terms of representation, especially from sort of a United States American perspective. Growing up, I think many of us often don't sort of connect ourselves with identity other than what we know from a cultural standpoint. Knowing who my parents are and the language that we might speak and knowing that it's different. I think having really starting to get involved from a community standpoint helped to shape that for me. Professionally, I've chosen to get into an organization that I oversee that really specifically focuses on representation and amplifying voices from the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And I think what I've recognized is that, because there are not that many of us who are often engaged and vocal, there's, a pretty significant responsibility on all of us from a community standpoint to see what we can do to advance representation, to sort of amplify the voices that we can. I think it's important to remind ourselves that what we're seeing today during the pandemic isn't unique to this time. nor is it unique to COVID-19. I think for many, there's actually a long history of Asian American racism and discrimination in the United States that isn't necessarily taught. It's not something that I learned growing up, nor did I learn when I was in college. And it's really being engaged in the community and speaking with others that we begin to tap into sort of the history and context that informs who we are today. And so I say that for not just for folks in younger generations, but really anyone in the community, I think there's a responsibility to take some time to understand the depth of our history. Because when we look back and we think about things like the Chinese Exclusion Act or Japanese incarceration during World War II, we begin to realize that what we're seeing during the pandemic is actually in some ways a repeat of history. And when we see it that way, we understand that what we're speaking up against isn't just something that was fostered or made worse during the pandemic, but something that actually connects much deeper and has a role in shaping who we are as a community and as a society moving forward.
How do you believe that the fight for AAPI equality fits in for I guess a larger fight for racial equality?
Yeah, I think they're actually synonymous. I think when we see hate that's been perpetuated against API communities, I think we have to remember that that's not dissimilar to what we've seen perpetuated against other communities for a long period of time, even if it's been more pronounced during this time period for APIs. Part of our work over the last year and a half, especially in San Diego, has focused around how do we help both API and non-API communities understand that we all have to actually work together to combat hate in general, and that we have a responsibility as a community to act against hate against any community. And I think that's a really significant reminder to walk away from this moment, because it's too easy to take a look at what's happening and say that we need to respond now, but we have to remember that, just last summer we were seeing sort of this racial reckoning for the Black community that, was a good reminder that many of us need to take a stand together. And so looking forward, I think, our responsibility is in seeing how we can work with other communities in solidarity so that we can advance, more compassion and more understanding and empathy in our world.